I'm deliriously happy to have Caro Murphy with us today. I've been a big fan of their work for a very long time, and I've admired their enthusiasm and their passion for LARP as an educator, as a practitioner, all of those things. So let me go ahead and read their bio. Caroline Murphy, or Caro, is a game and interactive experience designer. Currently a visiting associate professor at Northeastern University, Caro's career includes a notable tenure as immersive experience director for Disney's Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser. Woo! They co-lead the Playable Theater nonprofit promoting interdisciplinary creators in interactive live performance art. Caro serves as executive creative director of Incantrix Productions, crafting independent, interactive experiences globally and collaborating with writers and designers worldwide. With a rich educator background, they have taught game design and game business at leading institutions such as MIT and Harvard. And as the leader of Boston Fig, they served the independent game creator community for over 10 years. And just a little bit about myself, I'm Sarah Lynn Bowman from the Transformative Play Initiative. If you're new to our series, welcome. We are very interested in the use of role-playing games, especially analog role-playing games, as tools for personal and social change. I think I first met Caro in 2018 when they were keynoting for us for the Living Games Conference. And I was really inspired by their work then, and I still am today. So with that, I will give the floor to Caro.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so delighted to be here and such a huge fan of your work and your research, and you're an amazing inspiration. And I just love being here. So I'm going to get started. I'm just going to share my screen so everybody can see. So we are going to talk today about ritual and the importance of framing transformational experiences. So what do we mean by transformational experiences? Well, I actually would love to hear from you. Like, go ahead in the chat. Talk a little bit about what you think about when you think of a transformational experience. What does transformation mean to you? I want to see some of these answers and read some of these answers. Liminal moments that bring people into games from Ray. Thank you, Ray. Josh says, helping people see themselves or the world in a new way. B says, transformation experience are making me think about magical girls right now, getting ready to fight. Amazing. Christopher Bolts talks about reframing. Awesome. We're going to talk about that later. We've got explore possibilities, moments that create visceral connection, experience that's so outside of your daily life that it changes your understanding of the world and yourself. I love that one, Lucas. That's awesome. So many amazing answers. I super appreciate this. I'm going to allow everyone to continue to kind of talk about that and talk about the different ideas about transformation. So for me, when I think of a transformational experience, I think of something that that is a little bit of a state change, right? We think of, we're literally transforming something about our perspective, about perhaps the way that we move through the world, about the way that we make something known, right? So I'm going to get more into it. So hello, I've already introduced myself, but really, I have a huge passion for bringing live action role playing into the mainstream. I think it's a powerful medium for this transformation, right? And I think I'm here to repeat things that smarter people than I have said before and attempt to share a little bit about my own experiences of practice. So much of what I'm doing is building on the shoulders of giants. And the folks who are doing the work in this are incredible. And I would not be where I am without so many of you. Many of you who are here, in fact, in the chat too. Appreciate you. So what we'll discuss, this is obviously what we're going to talk about. This was in the talk description, so none of this should be surprising. But so many people have talked about the importance of ritual throughout human history. It's very important to the experiential arts. So I want to talk about it in terms of both inside of the magic circle and give some tools for how we create these experiences. And then outside of the magic circle, how do we use ritual practice in being able to facilitate productive processing for us when we go out of role? And I'm going to, discuss this in some of the experiences. So first, I want to frame everything up with a little bit of context about some of the theories from anthropology, religious studies, and cognitive science about, what makes this up. Then I want to talk about the onstage techniques for ritual making. This is a lot about just the performance of ritual and things that I think are essential to the form. Then backstage, I want to explore practices for creating these healthy boundaries outside of the magic circle. And then understanding. Well, I want to look through the lens of psychology and explore why this works and why this is powerful and why it's necessary for us to do this in order to facilitate good transformations. So let's get into the context. So what is a ritual? So here are some definitions of a ritual: a set of words or actions or words performed in a regular way, often as part of a religious ceremony. So, for example, in Zen Buddhism, our practice begins with 3 bows, a sutra service and readings, followed by silent meditation, then a talk and discussion, and more silent meditation, ending with 3 bows, right? So there's an example of a ritual that takes place in Zen. Or this other definition, a ritual is also any act done regularly, usually without thinking about it. And when I see this, I'm like, wait, what? What? These things don't track. This is very intentional, right? And this is very unintentional. So what I'm talking about here is not the unintentional thing. We're talking about the intentional thing. So with thanks to Jessica Crean, who gave this amazing workshop at the Next Stage Immersive Summit, she helped to kind of help break down some of these different ideas about habit, routine, ritual, and ceremony. And I want to use that as a little bit of inspiration for the way that I am talking about and defining these things. So a habit is an impulse to do a behavior with little or no conscious thought. It's something that is unintentional. It's estimated that up to 45% of our daily behaviors are habit. It's usually not attached to any meaning, and these are things that are individual. A routine, on the other hand, is a series of behaviors that is frequently repeated. It's usually intentionally undertaken. It's usually not attached to any meaning, and it's individual. Whereas a ritual is a series of behaviors that is frequently or occasionally performed, which is very intentionally undertaken. Usually it has an association with storytelling or meaning, and it can be performed by an individual or a group. And a ceremony is a series of behaviors that are performed on an occasion, right? This is a special occasion. It's undertaken intentionally. Usually there's an association with storytelling or meaning, and it includes a group. So a ritual can be a ceremony, but not all ceremonies contain rituals, but not all rituals are ceremonies. So anthropological theories. So there's in the late 1800s, anthropologists started kind of trying to figure out what were the origins of rituals. And this quickly became clear that there was no possible way for people to trace back when was the first ritual, because we've been doing it for so long that there is really no anthropological record of the first, right? There's evidence of rituals for as long as we have human history. So anthropologists around that time started coming up with different ideas. So there was a branch of anthropology that was called functionalism, in which they believed that rituals were to express a society's values, or to help stabilize the society, or to help relieve anxiety, or maybe it's both, or maybe it's neither. And they couldn't really agree on the relationship of anxiety to ritual. Is it to relieve anxiety, or does the anxiety create the need for the ritual. They couldn't. It's a kind of a chicken egg situation. Then structuralism comes in a little bit later and starts to talk about myth and ritual, and this idea that myth and ritual are like coexisting forces and that they require one another to exist and are imposed on societies in order to organize them. A lot of our modern thinking is very anti-structuralist. So structuralism is something that a lot of folks really no longer look to in order to kind of determine the ways in which we're moving through things. We're moving into a much more postmodern sort of society, or transmodern society. So maybe its purpose is to upend the social norms, or maybe it was to provide communication, or maybe it's to be a symbolic model for reality, or maybe it's to enact certain disciplines, or maybe it's to create social solidarity or control risk or measure religiosity. Basically, ritual purpose has almost no limitations, right? Ritual can be for so much, and the purpose behind it is limitless, really. I think it's a boundless sort of open and beautiful landscape that you can build on. In religious studies, there's this great scholar named Catherine Bell who did a lot of the organized thinking about ritual, and she wrote this great book called Ritual Perspectives and Dimensions. And she identified 6 characteristics, more or less, that she believed were part of a lot of different rituals throughout space and time. Catherine Bell was a huge proponent of sort of anti-structuralist thinking, also saying that she's creating these categories, but also the exceptions prove the rule, and that there are rituals that don't have these characteristics, or that only have one of these characteristics, or all kinds of things, but that a lot of them tend to share these types of characteristics. So formalism, the idea that ritual uses a limited and organized set of expressions. So there are formal ways of speaking, or like standing or gestures or things like that that are encompassed in the ritual. Traditionalism, that it appeals to tradition, and generally this is a continued and repeated historical precedent, right? Invariance, so the idea that rituals don't change over time and they have careful choreography. So in order to be the same ritual, that it is maintained throughout time, there's not a lot of variance. Rule governance, there tend to be rules or structures that create limitations and bounds around the ritual. Sacral symbolism, so rituals are often an appeal to some sort of supernatural force, whether that is an internally felt supernatural force of connection to a greater whole, or whether it is an appeal to a deity. There are these ideas of connecting to something greater. Performance, so rituals have a theatrical-like frame around their activities, which is one of my favorite parts. And then looking at cognitive science, so natural selection has this process that our brains run where we observe something, a situation taking place in our perception of reality. Then we create a story about what that is. Sometimes we quickly index and compare to other things that have happened in our experience, and then we create a story about what we think is happening. Then we experience emotions. We have a response to the story that we've created and whether or not it suits our requirements. And then we judge. We have a measure, an opinion about what these feelings are, and that is informed by the story and the observation, right? So this is a very quick cognitive process. Usually it feels like it's just one thing, but that ritual can help us kind of slowing down this process, and it helps us with meaning making, and it helps us with the storytelling, and perhaps telling stories in ways that are more appealing for us. There's also not a lot of agreement right now about whether or not we feel something and then tell a story about it, or whether we tell a story about something and then have a feeling about it, or maybe it's both, or maybe it's kind of a loop where we feel something, then tell a story about it, and then we tell another story about how we feel, and then we so there's still disagreement in the cognitive science world about kind of what this process exactly is, but we do know that we can slow it down. So I first want to talk about techniques that can help with ritual making on stage. So I'm going to use the terms on stage and off stage when talking in this context. I'm doing this because I have a lot of like theater background. I'll also be using the terms actor, and what I mean here is the same context of like on stage, I might mean in game, right? Or off stage, I might mean out of game. Actor, I might mean participant, and so on and so forth. I'll try to be clear with the terms as they come up. So these are activities that I believe are a toolkit to be able to create ritual. So preparation, you need structure and order. As we saw with Catherine Bell's requirements, there needs to be some rule boundedness to your ritual. Inclusion, these are participatory techniques. I think that this is really essential if you want your ritual to have staying power, if you want it to have transformational impact. Music and rhythm, which is a sensory experience, playing and listening. Physicalization, like this embodied practice. Improvisation, which helps to enable some presence in the moment. And performance, theatrical elements, and scene. So let's get into it and talk about some of these techniques a little bit more. So preparation, I think one of the first things you really need to do is set good expectations. So rituals need a conductor. Some might say a leader, some might say orchestrator, some might say the head of the ritual. I like the term conductor because it implies that this person is part of a greater organism and is helping to kind of conduct what's going on as a conductor would in an orchestra, but that they are not above or below, that there's not a hierarchy involved. So this person serves as a leader and ensures that the content of the ritual happens in the desired order. The conductor also coordinates all the other elements and activities and typically will narrate as the ritual takes place. The conductor needs to set expectations with other participants and other people who are playing a role and gain consent for whatever content is included in the ritual. So if you are being this orchestrator, I suggest that you lay out the order that you envision, how people will know that their part has come, and encouragement and enthusiasm for what people are contributing, and reassurance that they cannot mess up, right? So giving people that starting to build trust so that people are willing and excited to participate in this ritual. That will help people to get into a mindset where they are able to experience transformation. Creating a structure. Do use a simple 3-step framework. So other folks have written pretty extensively about improvised ritual and creating a circle or creating, whatever it is. I think I have used circles a lot for different rituals that I've created, but I think that really, as opposed to just being like a circle that you need to create, you should just create boundaries around the space, right? Like not all rituals take place within a circle, but you do want to make sure that people understand what boundaries are within the ritual space and which boundaries are outside of the ritual space. And you probably want to physicalize this as well. You probably want to actually draw a border or lay down markers or make it very clear what is the inside and outside of this frame. 2, appeal to forces. So that's the purpose of the ritual, right? Enacting the actual intent of the ritual, and then ending the ritual. So you're going to dissolve the boundaries of that space, maybe physicalize that as well, right? Breaking the sand line or picking up the items that are creating that boundary. Do not give a speech or create so many steps that you can't remember what comes next, or appropriate a marginalized culture that you don't understand, or disrespect a real religion. So physicalization, I think that this is such an important part of ritual practice. So I wanted to give some ideas for ways in which you can help to physicalize a ritual. So the first one is breath. So asking the participants to breathe together. This is especially great for folks who are movement challenged and may not be able to take place in like the dancing and other types of movement. Breath, this 5-5-5-5. So this is a breathe in for a 5 count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold for a 5 count. 2, 3, 4, 5, and out for 5, and then hold, and then you repeat that pattern. So as the ritual leader, you can do that count for people so that they start to breathe in rhythm together. Another great technique is having people put their arm up when they're breathing in, put their arm down when they're breathing out, and ask them to start to synchronize. So noticing when other people's arm are going up and down and starting to fall into rhythm with those around them. There's also a breath that you can use to kind of like hype things up, which is 3 rapid in breaths and 1 slow out. So and you'll feel like energy start to arise. And there's also a kind of coming down or mellowing out breath. So this is 3 slow out breaths and then 1 slow in. So and that will help to bring people back into a more settled place. You can also make your own. I encourage you to experiment with breath technique. There's all kinds of different things that you can do with breathing, and it's a great way to get people physicalizing something about this ritual. Next is movement. So I'm going to get into some of the specifics of movement a little bit more because I think that having techniques for this is so helpful. And so I want to talk about the 5 rhythms technique. So some devising building blocks, moving in unison. So this is doing a walking meditation or perhaps repeating a gesture that everyone can do together. You can make your own. Movement is a wonderful form to explore. There's also holding, right? So breathing, moving, and then holding. So you can ask participants to hold a space or hold space. So hold open an envisioned area, hold a body pose or a form, hold the gaze of another participant or hold a point of vision, hold contact with another person, of course, with consent. And make your own. But there's these other physicalizations are important to being able to enable this. So when I say embodiment, what I'm talking about here is a practice that makes something known. So our bodies are storytelling instruments. And so our bodies help to make known something that might have been unknown. So choicefully stepping through these observations, stories, feelings, and judgments, our bodies are present to that practice. So using our bodies in order to learn is an important part of, I think, ritual. So the 5 rhythms dance technique. So this was developed by a woman named Gabrielle Roth. And it is so easy to learn and it's so easy to pick up and it's so easy to encourage others to be able to pick up this practice as well. So the 5 rhythms are flowing, in which the body is moving in very fluid motions. There's staccato, in which the body's moving in lots of angles and sharp boundaries. There's chaos, in which the body's moving in wild and unfiltered motions. There's lyrical, in which the body moves to tell a specific narrative. And there's stillness, in which the body moves either in slow motion or not at all. And the practice of 5 rhythms usually has people go through the rhythms in this order of flowing, staccato, chaos, lyrical, stillness. But you can use these forms once you've taught a little bit about these types of movement to people. It's easy for them to shift directions and for you to call out like flowing or lyrical or chaos, and then have people respond accordingly. And that can be really, really lovely to incorporate into your ritual. There's also these building blocks for movement storytelling, and this is developed by Scott Graham, who's the artistic director of Frantic Assembly. I just learned about this week, and I'm currently obsessed with this. I think it's really like very beautiful. So there's this concept of round, by, through. So round, and those being kind of fundamental blocks for movement storytelling. So round being I go around my partner. By is I stand by my partner, and through, moving through my partner. So that might be moving under an arm or passing like through, a leg together, or moving, your bodies through one another's spaces. And then there's this also idea of time and the way that time relates to these different kinds of sensations. So there's before, touch, and after. So the world before the touch, which is the actual moment of touch, and then after, the world after the touch. And these can be modified and played with in order to create really, really powerful stories. So if I go to shake somebody's hand, the movement that I have before the touch will tell you a lot about the story of the scene, right? If I'm very hesitant and move slowly before I touch somebody, then that says something very different than if I aggressively move in and grab their hand. And then the reaction to that, right? So the moment of touch will tell you something as well, like how those people are interacting. And then the after, the world, like how have things changed after that moment of touch has taken place? Do I react, do I feel really good about myself afterwards? Do I feel discomforted? Whatever it is, like there are these ideas of time boundedness that you can play with. So playing with these concepts of round by through and then before touch after in order to build story around how that movement is going to work is really beautiful and something that's easily taught and practiced. Next up, I want to talk about inclusion. So these are some ways in which you can get people to participate. People participating in your ritual is so important. It's so essential for them actually being able to have that transformational experience. So first, calls and responses, creating moments of unified vocalization, right? So I recommend that it's simple, rhythmic, and memorable. It can be hopefully something that anyone can start and anyone can finish. If you make it simple, rhythmic, and memorable, then people will start to start the call and have the response all on their own. So teach it, reinforce it. You create culture as you create these calls and responses. And when people feel the ability to teach it and then spread it out to others, then that will create a culture all its own that will make people feel more included. Create roles. So divide up different parts of the ritual in order to make sure that you have other people involved. So you can have people who are movers, people who are chanters, people who are musicians, people who are timekeepers. You can make your own roles depending on the content and intention of your ritual. And then no audience. I think it's important to require participation so that people are using multiple sense organs. And by participation, it doesn't mean that people have to, be in the middle of the circle with you and doing something, but anybody who is watching the ritual should also be engaging with it in some way. So sense organs. So for feel or touch, you might have people stand or sit or kneel or genuflect. You might have state changes like they have water poured on them. They might touch objects. They might clasp their hands. They might place their hand over their heart. They might touch other participants with consent. C, you want to direct people's focus to look at something or look away from something, right? So that can be a powerful tool for getting people involved as well. Hearing, inviting someone to listen to something or to not listen to something, right? To clasp their hands over their ears if they're not supposed to hear something. They also, you can encourage them to hum or clap or snap or get involved with other things that can be heard. Smell, having incenses, flowers, oils, herbs, other things that will create a sense of different smell than what is normally in your environment is another way to create this kind of transformational state. And taste, if you would like to, it's not totally necessary, but rituals can absolutely include water or food or beverages or mints if you wanted to, all kinds of different things, but having something that awakens these different senses is really helpful. Music and rhythm, the power of music. So rituals need music. I think. It doesn't have to be complicated to be effective. And it is a factual truth that live music is the best. So, but music played over a speaker is okay too. If you are playing music over a speaker, then I also recommend that you hybridize it, right? Getting people to clap along, snap along, hum along, whatever it is, inviting that participation. Instruments that are super easy to include: drums, bells, singing bowls, flutes, whistles, chimes, cute little references to Over the Garden Wall. If you don't have instruments, you can hum, clap, sing, stomp, snap, throat singing. There's all kinds of other ways to involve yourself in musical process. And I think it's so powerful to have these things. People can feel a little bit shy about music sometimes, so it's helpful to find musicians who are willing to lead and willing to, jump in with a really strong drum beat, or jump in with a chant, or singing, so that others feel welcome to join in as well. Also, have a cue so that your musicians know when to stop. For example, setting expectations as we did before, right? Saying like, and then I'll say stop and you'll stop, or I'll hold my hand up like this and you'll stop. So that communicating that ahead of time so that you can kind of control when the musical cues are happening is helpful. Improvisation. So I think it's really important to build in blank spaces into your ritual. So try not to overscript it. Leave space for other people to contribute. There are no mistakes. There are just opportunities for even greater storytelling. So if somebody does something that wasn't totally intended, there's something that you can build there, right? That's an opportunity for you to help them make meaning of why that happened. Make eye contact with each participant and react, right? Sell what is happening, and allow yourself to feel what is happening and to demonstrate that that is okay. You're going to demonstrate culture and encourage presence in the moment. And performance, theatrical elements, right? Don't underestimate the great power of theater craft. So set, like having chalk circles, fabrics or curtains, maybe pillars or standing stones, special effects like smoke effects and things like that. Lighting. So you might want to have actual theatrical lights that you set up. You might just have like LEDs that you can like turn on with a switch or a timer. If you have proper supervision, you can have fire, torches, candles, fire sculptures, all kinds of cool things like that. And then properties, right? You want to have elements that you can bring into the ritual: water, incense, herbs, bowls, perhaps wands, daggers, bones, bottles, cloth, blindfolds, whatever it is. The sky's the limit when it comes to the properties that you can include. And finally, with performance, really, there's cadence. There's, like all great storytelling, a great ritual has an energetic cadence to it, where you have this idea of the exposition, where the ritual leader is going to talk about the purpose of the ritual, why we are all gathered here, what is going to happen, how we're going to be changed afterwards. Rising action, where you're building all the different elements, your music is playing, you have people moving, you have each element coming together, and it's all in a prescribed order that people understand. The climax of the ritual, right? Like the point of whatever it is that you have come here to do now reaches its culmination. And then finally, it kind of drops off. And then afterwards, you have this, what is the result? Like, what are the outcomes? What happened? Did it succeed? Did it fail terribly? So being able to kind of have a storytelling and like energy that you feel in that ritual is going to be really important for it feeling really good. So I'm going to start to move into the discussion of offstage. So using ritual outside of the magic circle in order to help mitigate risk. So I say risk instead of safety because I have more recently been made aware of this idea that there is no such thing as a perfectly safe environment, right? We are always going to take on certain levels of risk. And what we can do is make it known and to mitigate risk in ways that work for us. So one way of doing that is to create a container. So what do I mean by container? So I think that in this type of work, it's really important to create healthy understandings and boundaries about the experiences of the character and the experiences of the actor. So role players need to be able to move into the mindset of the character and back into their own mindset in a way that's helpful for them to maintain good mental health. And this is doubly true for villains. I cannot stress that enough. So getting into character, so I call it N rolling, and then getting out of character, D rolling, which is certainly not a term that I have coined. People have been using that for a long time. Doing this in deliberate ways is really critical to this process. So I'm going to talk about some techniques that that I have used and that I think are helpful. So why is this necessary? So there's this fantastic article called Debriefing Intense LARPs 101, and a lot of my inspiration for this comes from there, and I think that some of the words that are used are really helpful. So number one, character bleed. Sometimes there can be a personalization of the events that occur on stage, and there's a blurring that can happen between the actor and the character. Now, when that happens in really positive ways, we like that, right? That's kind of the goal. It's the purpose. We want to feel and experience these beautiful things. When it's happening in a negative way, it can really impact you in a way that's hard to go about living your kind of, back to reality normal life. Two, post-game depression. So this feeling of drop or blues that can cause emotional weight, which can also negatively impact the actor or the role player's real life. And post-game charisma, a feeling of euphoria that can linger and that can influence behaviors in ways that will negatively impact a role player's real life, right? So these are different things that we need to be aware of. So one N rolling technique that I like to use is creating a character playlist. So you create a playlist for the character with songs that remind you of events that have happened in that character's life and evoke feelings that the character frequently experiences. And so you listen to that playlist as you prepare for your performance, and you think about each of the songs very intentionally and why they apply to that character and not to you. And I recommend that you choose songs that you don't listen to frequently, that aren't going to like come up in your just regular listening playlists. Another N rolling technique is putting on your costume with a lot of consciousness and intention. So you are putting on the layers of the character, adding their makeup or scents. I do think it's really important to have multiple sensory experiences for the character, not just their semblance, but it can be really helpful to have a scent that is kind of like a character associated specifically with that character. Jewelry and trinkets, just anything else that evokes that character for you. As you're getting into the character's clothes and scents and jewelry and makeup, reflect on what you like about that character that makes them different than who you are. This is a technique that I'm calling an endurance technique, and this is in the event that you are in a professional setting where you're portraying a character and you are doing so where the option to just kind of go off stage is not always available to you. And I mean, ideally you're in an interactive environment where you can walk off, but sometimes you might be in the middle of a scene and something happens. And so this is to help with like that resiliency. So backstage, you have a bowl of different rocks or gems. So before you go on stage, you select a stone and you ascribe your intention to it as an actor, whether it's soothing or strength or protection, or you can look up the classical meaning of the stone if that helps. So you keep that to yourself. You don't tell anybody what it is. On stage, you carry it in your pocket, and then if anything comes up that you need to remind yourself of your intention, you have that actual physical object there. You can reach into your pocket and you can touch it. You take note of when you do that. At the end of your day, you take the stone out and you wash it. And as you do so, you recall every time that you touched it and why, like what was coming up. And then you imagine washing all of that away. And then you return the stone to the bowl. So we pioneered this technique over my tenure at Star Cruiser, and people were really, really shocked about how well it worked. But it really did work. It helped people with even things like memory and retention and all kinds of other things. And now let's talk about some de-rolling techniques. So having a really conscious removal of that costume, just the inverse of what we did as we were getting into character. Now we're doing that as we're getting out of character. So as you get out of costume, you're doing so with the intention of shedding the layers of the character, removing makeup, removing scents, removing jewelry, anything else that invokes that character to you, you're going to take all of that away. As you're doing that, and as you're getting into your own clothing, your own scent, your own jewelry, your own makeup, reflect on what you like about yourself that makes you different than your character. Another really helpful de-rolling technique is shake it off. So this is after you get out of costume. Physically shake your limbs in your body in order to shake the character off. Many characters have their own way of moving, and sometimes it can be hard to de-physicalize something once you've physicalized something. So shaking the body can help to kind of reset this. So concentrate on how your body feels when you hold yourself as you instead of as your character. And then repeat this as necessary until you feel like you're in your own skin again. This technique is also incredibly helpful if you experience something that is upsetting or triggering on stage. If you are experiencing something that is upsetting or triggering on stage, leave stage immediately and do this. It helps. It really, really helps. Another de-rolling technique that is very popular is this idea of a ritual farewell. So I like to create a circular space, usually with others, holding a piece of that character's costume. This is once we're completely out of role now. Have a piece of that character's costuming or something that represents them. Speak something aloud that you like about that character, and then something that you think that character has to work on. Then you say goodbye to the character for now. You place that item in the center of the circle, and you use both hands to do that. And then once everybody has gone around and had a chance to do that, you dissolve that circle. So again, a little bit of that ritual format of like creating the space, doing the intention, dissolving the space. Have a myself playlist. So create a playlist that's for you, that have songs that remind you of important events in your life. And listen to that playlist after you're finished with your performance. Think about each of those songs, why they apply to you and not to the character. And here, choose songs that you do listen to frequently, things that give you positive feelings and give you lots of memories of your own experiences in life. I'm going to talk a little bit about aftercare. So we're going to talk a little bit about something called debriefing. So debriefing helps you process your onstage experiences constructively. And a good debrief allows participants to spend time reflecting on their experiences, sharing stories, and processing feelings. They can serve to enrich understanding, connecting the experience to a lesson or a truth or an idea. And this is important. It doesn't tell participants how to do this, but instead asks the right questions, right? Asking thoughtful questions and helping the participant to make the connection for themselves. What it isn't. There are like lots of different ideas about what is included in a debrief. These are things that I like to exclude from the debrief. So I don't think that it is a time to reveal what really happened. My reasoning here is that this invites an idea that there is a single truth about what happened and that it's under that facilitator's authority potentially. I don't think it's time to critique the design because this is a sensitive time. Often this can invite a lot of reactivity that may be wildly destructive to the social cohesion and good relationships of your community. Time to tell war stories. So I think that like this is if you feel confident in your ability to facilitate, then I think this can be incredibly positive. So there's Sarah and Evan did this great bit of research about how epic tales can create really positive appreciation and this idea of retelling power, right? My experience is that if it's not facilitated well, that this can go poorly. So there are different ways to approach this. This is just what I've found effective. So the goals of a debrief are to validate someone's experience, whatever it was, right? It's a chance to be heard and understood, to process emotions, right? Starting to translate those experiences into lasting memories and reflections and learnings, and to gain awareness, especially if you've experienced something difficult. This is a way for other people to become aware of the problem and that you can start taking steps together towards solving it. These are Eric's 5 rules of a debrief. Confidentiality, no interrupting, all experiences are equal, the door is open, and use the third person. I think that these are really helpful rules of thumb. And I've also developed some other practices around this as well that I'll get into in a minute. So my suggestion here is that you open the debrief much like you would open any other ritual space or circle, right? So I like to create a circle. I like to go around this debrief circle one by one and read the agreements aloud. And I'll show you what these agreements are in just a second. This is something that I like to call circle practice, of like going around one at a time in a circle. And this is helpful because it ensures that there's space and time that's made available to everybody. So these are the debrief agreements. I love to have people read these aloud. So try it on. When new ideas or ways of doing things are presented, try them on instead of instinctively rejecting them. Practice self-focus, speak from your own experience, and practice noticing where you are. Humility and not knowing. When offering suggestions, try to come from a place of wondering and exploration rather than presumed knowing or certainty. Move up and move back in speaking and listening. So notice when you're taking up space or not taking up space, and move up and move back accordingly. Understand the difference between intent and impact. So in this space, we can validate intent while also recognizing that impact is sometimes separate from intent, right? So our interactions with one another, that good intent does not negate the impact that somebody else experiences. Embrace both and. Notice that multiple things can be true at once rather than one negating the other. Aspire to refrain from shaming or blaming. So it can be helpful to remember that we're all subject to these dominant discourses in our culture, and that we're all trying to cultivate compassion for ourselves and for others. Practice mindful listening. Notice when you're not listening, right? When you're engaged in something else, like you're planning what to say, come back again to listening when it's appropriate for you to be listening. Confidentiality. We can share what we've learned, but not other people's stories. And we can follow up with group members, but ask permission when doing so. Option to pass, even if no one else does. You can always choose to not share or not read or participate in any activity. You can share ouch and oops. So we can acknowledge when we have caused or received hurt, and we can pause in those moments collectively to hold them together. And we can expect and accept non-closure. So growth is an ongoing internal and interpersonal process. And it doesn't mean that you have to have a decided outcome by the end of the debrief. So facilitating something like this, if you as a facilitator notice that one of these agreements is not being put into practice, you can just gently guide your participant back to the agreement with a reminder. So, hey, Eric, I want to remind you that of the self-focused agreement. Could you try telling us that same thing again, but from your own perspective? And that will help to ensure that people are kind of being mindful of these agreements. I like to have this kind of structure for a debrief. I like to do this high point, low point exercise. So this is allowing people to tell these stories, but it's also creating these, differences and separations between the experiences of the character and the experience of the participant. So first, you speak about the high and low point of the character, and you use third person and past tense language, right? My character went here, she experienced this, she saw that, those kinds of things. Then you speak about your own personal high and low, making sure to use first person language. So I really liked it when I saw this thing happen and it made me think of this, and things like that. So it's helpful to do this, in my opinion, because it allows you to notice where there's overlap. And that will help you understand if this is a situation in which you're experiencing positive bleed or negative bleed. And you'd be surprised how often people are surprised by this high point, low point. And when the character is starting to become more encompassing is where you start to see some of those negative experiences starting to bleed over more. So facilitator questions, ask, don't guide. Allow the participant to self-guide and really try to avoid criticism or cheerleading. So these questions were developed with the help of a clinical social worker and therapist. So questions like, what stood out to you? How do you understand that? Does this bring up any images or metaphors for you? What does that tell you about your commitments to life or your beliefs or your dreams? What were you valuing by making that choice? How will you be transported by what you witnessed today? So allow the participant to create their own meaning. Like, these questions are open-ended and allow them to fill in the gaps for themselves. And when somebody tells you how they're making meaning of something, believe them. Finally, I suggest that you close the debrief. So use that same circle practice, allow each participant to express one word that is whatever is coming up for them, then offer everybody thanks, and then everyone offers thanks to whoever is speaking at the time, and this repeats until everybody is done. Then as a facilitator, you thank everybody for their presence and their contributions, and you just clearly tell them the debrief is now over. And so that helps to end and put a cap on the experience. So when it's done in this way, your debrief is a ritual. So you have this formalized kind of opening of the circle, you have the actual content of what is happening, and you have a formalized closing of the circle as well. Things to look out for, moral hangover. So sometimes the actor, through their own role playing, has felt their own ability for cruel and immoral actions, and that is okay. So immoral people don't feel moral hangovers, but it is totally normal to experience this. Relationship hangover, feelings both positive and negative that are felt for someone else can remain after the experience is over. And this is also completely normal. And talking about it is really helpful. Social exclusion. So sometimes a character was socially excluded. This especially happens with villains, or they lived with the threat of, or the fear of that sense of alienation, and that can persist. I think it's even more important to be included in that debrief and to made a part of the group in order to help combat that feeling of social exclusion. This is also a technique that I think is really cool. So Jenny Harrell, who is doing a ton of research right now on resources for actors and creating a ton of resources for actors, has created this website called ghostlighton.org. And she's experimenting with different ways to allow actors to kind of like get out of character. So she created this framework called the breakup letter for when a role player or an actor and a character are parting ways for the final time. So this is a way to like formally say goodbye to the character for good. So it includes addressing the character, expressing your feelings, acknowledging the challenges, reflecting on the growth, saying farewell, having a moment of closure, kind of letting the character know how you'll be moving on, and your signature. I'm really excited to see the work that Jenny is continuing to do out there in the world, and excited for what she comes up with. So I've did a little consultation with Bailey, and she's an incredible narrative therapist, and she gave me a really good understanding of the psychological underpinnings of these techniques and how they work and why they work, right? So from a philosophical standpoint, the underpinning here is tied to this idea of postmodernism. So postmodernism views reality as always shifting and changing and deeply personal. And in postmodernism, there is no objective truth. So the truth is what each one of us makes of it. And that is influenced by social norms and ideas. So some of the main principles that are applied in the framework of narrative therapy are that reality is socially constructed, that reality is influenced and communicated through language. So if people speak different languages or have different ways of understanding language, they may have radically different interpretations of the same experience. That having a narrative that can be understood helps people to organize and maintain their own cohesive reality. So stories and narratives make sense of experience. And that there is no objective reality or absolute truth, and that what is true for us might not be true for another person, or even ourselves at a different point in time, right? So narrative therapy, which was developed in the 1980s by Michael Waite and David Epstein, believes that the problem is the problem and the person is not a problem. So there's a big emphasis on externalizing problems so that people aren't taking on problems as identity. So narrative therapy is respectful, narrative therapy is non-blaming, and narrative therapy views the client as the expert. I think that these principles are super important when it comes to the debrief and the way that we ask questions in the debrief, right? We want to maintain utter respect for the participants. We want to avoid shaming or blaming people. And we want to allow people to create their own truths, their own narratives, and their own realities in which we're not placing too much of our own influence over what people are experiencing. So why this works? So the working theory is that the individual and the character are actually witnessing one another when you take it from this frame. So what's actually happening is you're creating integration. So this is a non-separation, and this creates an understanding of each other's experience, narratives, values, and identities. So this is very similar to a practice called outsider witnessing, but interestingly, instead of witnessing an outsider, you're witnessing the character, and the character is witnessing you, and you're understanding your identities and the differences between you as something that you accept as non-separate. So in spite of what I was saying earlier about creating these boundaries, the actual psychology here is due to an honest acknowledgement and acceptance of the non-separation of self, right? It's not about exclusion or aversion. It's about this conscious and formalized acceptance and incorporation of experience. And really, more research is needed here for us to understand the psychology of this even better. So I think I have talked and talked, and now I am excited to hear from all of you and move into our Q&A. If you'd like to keep in touch with me, then this is my email and my name on social media and all this other stuff, and some credits for what we saw these beautiful visuals.
Thank you so much, Caro. That was so interesting. And maybe you might want to stop sharing the screen and we can have a little chat. Okay, well, this is all right up my alley, unsurprisingly. I'm going to ask a question first, just to kind of a clarifying question that others might be curious about as well. So we talk about LARP as a ritual in and of itself. And then there's rituals that can happen within the LARP that move even more deeply into ritual. And here you're also talking about the off-game ritualization space as well. So when you're talking about the
way down.
yeah, exactly, ritual all the way down. That's the best way of putting it. When you're talking about these different components of ritual in the beginning, are some of those more suited for deeper layers of ritual rather than, the sort of like beginning frame of the LARP, or do you see them as useful at all stages? I'm thinking about things like music, for example, that, for a talking LARP that might get in the way of the experience. Just what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when I was coming up with the sorts of elements that I think would be like fun to include in ritual, I was thinking of games that, I mean, you would probably want a game that takes place over at least an hour so that the ritual isn't taking up the entire space of the game. But I did a ritual in a game that was a hiking LARP, for example, that the game only took place over the course of an hour. And then at the end of it, we had a ritual in order to kind of like determine outcomes. So using a lot of those same structures and processes, like, we basically like improvised a ritual on the spot and everybody got into it and participated. That was with a small group of players, like maybe 10 players. So I think that these things can apply to, and this was a group of strangers. So it was like no one I'd ever played with before. So I think that the more that you get comfortable with ritual, the easier it will be to start to like incorporate it into your everyday LARP kind of thing.
And kind of related to that, which of these do you think might be useful for like more of a Zoom role-playing experience or more of a tabletop role-playing experience?
Oh, great question. Over Zoom, I think like there are some just constraints that you would need to work around, especially in terms of like the way that you would share music or the way that you might move together and things like that. But I think that you could probably find workarounds for a lot of these different elements to make sure that they're kind of like effectively being broadcast to everybody and everyone is in sync with them. Um, I love to make people move when they're on Zoom because I think we have this like tendency to just sit still and feel like if we are moving around a lot, then that's going to be like weird or distracting. So I remember running rehearsals over Zoom for groups of actors, and playing a bunch of music and being like, okay, everyone's just going to do a weird dance and we're just going to look weird in front of each other and that's going to be okay. So I think that there's a lot that you can still do over Zoom. And tabletop role-playing games, again, I think that there's that tendency to feel as though we can't physicalize something. But I think that the physicalization is so important to the transformative power, right? Like for me, I want to like really physically feel an experience. And I think that for some people, they feel an in with transformational experience coming from a very emotional place where they have quick and easy access to a rich emotional world. And for other people, that might not be a door in. So for other people, like that physical door is a much more accessible door. So if you can make people like physically feel embodied, feel exhausted, feel joyous, like feel their blood rushing, then that can be a door that then helps to open up the emotional experience.
Absolutely. And I also think that we often assume that LARP is embodied, whereas tabletop is not, which is actually not true. We're embodied always, right?
Yes,
Um, so
100%. Absolutely.
all right, let me just go to the Q&A. Thank you for your talk and all of the information, inspiration. In regard to the repetition of ritual actions, for example, during a LARP that contains several sessions, what effects would you think repetition has on players, supporting or hindering transformational experiences?
Oh, interesting. Um, well, I don't know, but I think if you're talking about the effects of a ritual in game, then that's something that I think would require some research. I don't know that I've ever experienced a LARP where there was a repetition of a ritual, not a super formalized one. Although that's maybe not true because I have been at LARPs in which there have been like Sunday services sort of thing. And people go to their in-game church and have in-game ritual services performed. And in those instances that I've seen, it provides an incredible sense of community cohesion. And that more and more you'll start to see that it like draws in players who aren't necessarily from that in-game culture or in-game religion because they want to be a part of the cool thing that's happening. So that can also provide a lot of like community structure, which is lovely. In terms of over time in an out of game sense, it really, really helps. Like my experience with Star Cruiser is that it really helped people with maintaining their mental health over time. That I witnessed during that time, seeing a lot of actors who were not used to role-playing environments necessarily become very adept very quickly at this idea of creating boundaries between themselves and their characters. Because if they didn't, it would cause them a lot of harm. So it was a skill that they needed to adapt. And so we worked like very, very hard on creating these practices and formalizing them and making sure that everybody had the knowledge of how to engage with them and practice them. So I think that in those types of frames, it's really, really necessary. I think
I'm
it should
think
be standard.
I'm thinking about that though, with regard to what you were talking about, that it really is us that we're playing here. So when we talk
Yeah.
about writing a breakup letter to our character, that actually gave me kind of a negative emotional response in that, what if this is a part of me that I don't want to disavow or disown?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're getting super deep here, but like this becomes really interesting with regard to what I hear a lot of actors talking about with, you have to have that separation. You can't do method, method LARPing in this case, or method acting.
Yeah.
But when we're bringing up so much of our own personal content, eh, one of the things we theorize is there could be a barrier to transformation if we totally disavow those parts.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think that like and this is, speaking from my personal experiences, but that for me, the times in which I have felt the most transformation with a character come from a deep integration of that character and an acknowledgement and like belief and knowledge that the self is unlimited and expansive and that whatever parts of my like identity that were coming up in that character are deeply rooted in me as well, and perhaps in all beings, like we don't know. so um so yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that the idea of the breakup letter was I like that Jenny's concept includes a lot of these things that are like acknowledging the challenges, acknowledging like it to me seems like another frame of this outsider witnessing, right? Where it might on its face look like it's creating a boundary or compartmentalization, but I think that what it actually is like a true acknowledgement and integration of experience.
Maybe a different name would be a little bit
Yeah,
less jarring, I think, in that regard. But it's a very interesting conundrum, the self and the other and the character and all of that.
really.
Let's see. I'm curious if you can talk about enrolling and de-rolling in a setting where there's limited time or capacity. So sometimes we can't read out a long list of our group norms around sharing. So what's the
Yeah.
quick and dirty version?
Ooh, I think it depends on your participants, and it depends on the trust that you have established with people. I think that if you are in a high trust environment in which people know each other, then a lot of these practices can look a lot more informal, right? Where it's more of a like, wow, that was really cool. That was awesome. That's great. That's all the debrief you need kind of thing. Um, but I also think that like I think that it's more and more I feel as though these sorts of things need to be built in, especially in very high intensity situations. If you're playing a very low stakes, low intensity sort of game, then it might not require as much. But I'm starting to really come around to this belief that especially in corporate structured environments in which we were asking somebody to, as they're living, to play a character, that we owe those actors this process, that we owe people this feels like the minimum to me of what we should be providing, and that they should be paid for that time, and they should receive care, and that they should receive mental health services, and they should receive support systems for doing this. Um, yeah, these are not easy things to do, and I think that people often sort of take for granted, like, oh, well, they're actors, they get to, just play pretend for a living, must be nice. It's like, no, that's work. That's work, and it's hard work very often.
I won't quote the person because I don't have permission, but I was talking to an art therapist about this years ago, and this person was a little horrified at how little debriefing we do, even in a highly conscious community around like tabletop and LARP, even when we're having a debrief, and which a lot of communities don't, when we're having one at all, because
Yeah.
in their practice, they spend hours coming back, like hours of coming back from the ritual. And we're talking about a weekend experience, but the same could be said for a weekend LARP. So anyway,
Yeah.
it really gave me a lot of food for thought on how to extend that time. Maybe you don't have it in the event itself, but maybe you have practices that you send them home with, or you have ways for
Uh,
them to connect with community outside of the experience.
there's some practices that I think are really helpful that I have experienced. So in Zen, if you go on sesshin, you sit in silent meditation for days on end, and you don't realize it at the time, but your perception is being drastically altered. And once you come out of sesshin, it is recommended that you do not make any big life decisions for at least 48 hours. Like that, you need to give it some time. And I think that that is a great practice for LARP as well. Maybe don't make any huge sweeping life decisions in the 48 hours after you've had a powerful experience at LARP. Additionally, I really like what I've seen instituted in some LARP communities with the idea of a week of joy. Just after the LARP is over, there are no sharing of critiques or negative opinions or anything like that until 1 week has passed. Like, give it some time to rest and see if you feel as strongly about it a week from now as you did in the time just after. So the idea of like, we are just going to celebrate and express positive things in this week after the experience is finished. And then we will get into analyzing and dissecting and critiquing it a little bit later once it's had a little more time to settle. I love that practice, and I wish more LARPs did that.
There's certainly a lot of opinions about the week of stories or week of joy that we don't have time to get into. I personally do think that it's important to get to positive emotions rather quickly, just because it can become a contraction loop. If we're in this very expansive experience, then and we get contracted and we sort of reinforce that contraction, then we might actually miss some of the really positive things about the experience. That being said, we don't want to minimize anything that negative that might have happened. So
Absolutely.
it's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah,
We have so many questions. I'm going to try to go through them. People are really excited about this content, unsurprisingly.
awesome.
Let's
Thanks for
see.
being here, y'all.
Yes. Um, Somebody's asking a question that LARPs uh, often are posited as more about fun. So, what kind of intents towards transformation and what kind of transformation have been happening through LARPs? That is a huge question. And actually, we
Yeah.
have an article that maybe one of my co facilitators can drop into the chat, the transformative game design one, because it has a long list of potential types of transformation. But I'm super curious to hear from your perspective, like maybe your own personal experience. How has LARP been transformative for you?
Oh, wow. I think that for me, the easiest thing to point to is the that LARP allowed me a space to explore gender identity in a way that helped me to really make a lot of sense of my experience in the world and how I move through it. And I don't think that I would have come to it nearly as quickly or to feel safe in doing it without having LARP in order to be able to do that.
And I mean, that's the one that I tend to point to the most because I hear it over and over again. And it's something
Yeah,
about creating this ritual space where it's okay to self-present in ways that maybe you weren't socialized to do or weren't is not allowed to do. That is powerful. And
absolutely.
within that, we have another question. What do you think about the potential of LARP to transform rituals that in daily life might be felt of as actually oppressive? And using LARP as a platform to re-experience them in a positive way.
Oh, what's coming up for me is this idea of freedom and discipline. And I think that my and when a younger me would have said that freedom and discipline were opposing forces, but now I have a different idea about it, which is that through discipline we're able to find greater freedom. So, like, the example I can give is that in stretching, you gain better mobility. So, but you have to enact the discipline of stretching every day if you want to improve your mobility. I think this is true of it feels like it applies to me to this idea of taking ritual into LARP that can help you to transform your experience of it.
Mhm. And in this case, it was specifically framed as like rich social rituals that already exist, like marriages or things like that, that might have actually felt
Mm,
very oppressive, and then replaying them in a LARP situation and maybe gaining some sort of transformative power, like empowerment from that. Um,
absolutely. I love that. That's amazing.
let's see. Another big question. Where do you see the line for facilitators in terms of therapeutic responsibility? Advice for being able to recognize where conducting a debrief starts to become beyond your pay grade. Perhaps this relates to a feeling of a
It,
ritual going off the rails.
yeah, it sure does. I think that this is incredibly tricky. This is a really, really difficult question, which is one of the reasons why I consulted with a licensed therapist in order to help develop these questions. I think that it's really wonderful that that there's so much interest in our community in creating frameworks for debrief and facilitation that like help people with processing. I don't think it's actually game runners' responsibility, but I think that it's that I invite the opportunity to collaborate with people who are experts in these fields to be able to develop processes that I think are going to be more repeatable, more helpful, and to keep people from starting to devise techniques that are going to be really harmful.
And I'm curious about that. Most people will say, well, I don't, if it's a hobby, for example, I can't pay for a mental health professional to be on site. But what about in something like Star Cruiser, where you do have budget? Was that something that was part of the way that you structured those events?
Um, I think it should be. I think that this is, especially in professional spaces, I think that having those resources on site is something that we should start to push for as industry standard. Um, Huge advocate for that. At Star Cruiser, we didn't know what we didn't know going into it. So a lot of what we did was uh really just figuring out, like nobody had ever attempted to run a 24/7 immersive experience for 2 years straight before. It was a different beast. So I think that the learnings from that, I am hoping that the industry will take forward and say, okay, if we want to have experiences that we create like this in the future, this is the bare minimum. This is what we owe to our actors. This is what we owe to our cast, you know?
Yeah, I agree. Do you have any suggestions for how a facilitator might help participants who are new overcome discomfort, shyness, or self consciousness and empower them to participate fully?
I think that the easiest way is to demonstrate playful culture and don't push, you know? I think that people will start to inform you about when they are ready to kind of leap out of the nest a little bit. Um, I think part of this is also a little bit of just like developing some skill in reading people. Sometimes you can see someone has like a sparkle in their eye and you see they want to dance, but they're shy, right? And then you can just invite them and say, "Hey, I get the feeling that you want to dance. Is that true? Like, can I help you with that? Can I show you how?" Um, so and sometimes people will just say no and accept the no, you know, just like people will let you know their limitations. Um, but I also think that like creating playful culture and demonstrating play is a really, really helpful way to develop like the ability for people to step outside of their comfort zone in a way that they might not normally before. This is one of the reasons why a lot of immersive experiences have like plants or shills or things like that, right? Is because there's somebody there who is like a super outgoing person who then can demonstrate what a good playful culture looks like, and that helps other people who are shy to feel a little bit more comforted.
Hmm. And I was thinking about, what you were saying earlier about the different components and how you can give them something really basic to do so
Mm-hmm.
that they can feel a part of it. And I was also thinking of a recent ritual where I was asked to sit for 3 hours and just sit while things were happening around me. And this was a very powerful experience, like waiting to talk to an NPC, essentially, although they didn't frame it that way. This was a powerful experience for some people, but for me, it was really hard for me to stay engaged, especially with like back problems and things like that. So I think like having that little thing that they can do that doesn't feel too hard might bridge that gap based on what you're saying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even if it's just like, I need you to direct your gaze to this point and do not break it. Or I need you to breathe in rhythm with somebody. Or I need you to cover your ears and make sure you cannot hear the sound that is about to be made, kind of thing. You know, so little ways to engage people and get them to participate so that they're not just sitting on the sidelines waiting for 3 hours to be engaged.
I'm trying not to sound judgmental around that, you know. I mean, there's definitely like a trance element to this whole ritual that, you know, but if your mind's not there, then it's really hard to stay in it. So thinking about this design space as one that creates opportunity for engagement, I think is important.
Yeah.
There are a lot of questions. One of them is about your slides. Would you be willing to make those available so that we can just link them and send them out so that people have
Yeah,
the list of debriefing questions?
absolutely. I would be delighted to.
Awesome. Could, I'm not sure. Could you say it's necessary with rituals when you create a culture in LARP? I'm not for sure what that means in this particular context, but maybe does ritual help create a shared culture? It might be, or that it's necessary to have a ritual to create a shared culture.
Is it necessary? Probably not. Is it helpful? Absolutely. Yeah. At the very least, you're providing a surface in which people will have a shared experience and have an ability to participate with one another. And that can create a lot of community cohesion.
Okay. Well, the thing is, we have 3 more minutes. So we can either go a little longer and answer people's questions, or I can choose one, like golden ticket question. What is your preference?
Oh, let's go a little longer.
Okay, good. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Do people come to LARP specifically for transformation as well as fun, or is it a nice side effect if it happens?
Oh, I think that totally depends on the player. I know that for me, it's kind of what I am seeking. I'm often seeking sort of like, well, not often. Sometimes I'm seeking this feeling of catharsis or transformation or peak experience or flow. So that can absolutely be something that people like are undertaking intentionally. But I think that for many people, they may not, especially I think newer LARPers or people who are brand new to the format, will often be incredibly surprised by the power of the outcomes that they feel. What's that saying? The first cut cuts deepest. This idea that like if you've never experienced anything like this in this format before, then it can be very overwhelming to do these embodied things and to live into the experience of sort of dissolving yourself and becoming someone else for a little while.
Yes, and I would agree that it's definitely case by case. I mean, there's some people that are absolutely unwilling to acknowledge, even if it's obvious they've experienced some transformation over time, like that's not why they go there and they don't want to process that. And then there's other people like myself, and I think probably similar to you, your mode of engagement where it's like I can't help but process. Like it's just sort of the way that I connect with the world and with experiences of all sorts. So it really depends. But the Transformative Play Initiative, we're really what we're looking at is how do we intentionally design experiences, and that's one of the things you said in the very beginning of this talk. Like, how do we intentionally design for transformative impacts? And part of that is transparency from our perspective. Like the people need to be on board for what we're doing. Otherwise, it's, you know, first of all,
Yes.
harder
Send.
for for them to, yes, it's, I mean, obviously it's ethically better consent wise, but also it's harder for that transformation to happen if people aren't on board with it. But the other component of that is not forcing one particular outcome either, like kind of being open to what this form is good at, which is all sorts of random things that we could have never expected, and like embracing that.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking of the vision or aim for the ritual. It may impact a lot how you are creating it. Could you say something about the designer conductor's intentions and the aims and what kind of rituals or ritual building blocks? So I think this goes back into that intentionality, and it sounds like the practicalities of it.
Yeah, I think that something that is coming to mind for me right now as I'm hearing this question is this idea of the conductor like performing the ritual with a certain intent in mind. My experience with it is that when I am playing conductor of a ritual, that ritual is never for me. It's usually like there is an unfulfilled need among the player base, and I have identified what that is, and now I am structuring something that is going to create a scene and a cohesive environment so that that unmet need is potentially met, right? So I think that part of that has to do with like identifying what the unmet need is that will be the most fun for other people to engage with, which is like a really high level skill of discernment that that you'll practice over time. I mean, you can absolutely also conduct rituals that are just fun and silly. Like at Drachenfest, there was a ritual for two skeletons to get married because people wanted to have a skeleton wedding, and it was great, and it was lighthearted and lovely, and they included all those wonderful elements, but like the intention there was very much just to like do something very fun and silly and lighthearted.
We've been dabbling a little bit in peace and conflict studies theories, and the needs theory that we're working with is William Glasser's, and he says there's 5 basic human needs, and they're not in a hierarchy. Of course, you'll hear different needs depending on who you ask, but in this one, there's belonging, love and belonging, security, power, freedom, and fun. So fun is that last one, so
Yeah, yeah.
probably like if you can like think about those basic needs whenever you're creating any ritual and find ways to address at least 1 or 2 of them, you're probably doing it the right way. Like belonging being a really important one. Like if your ritual makes people feel excluded, which is something that you brought up earlier, then it's probably not working very well, right?
Right. Absolutely. And I wonder how that maps to the Enneagrams. I love to look at the Enneagram types in terms of needs because
Mm.
all the Enneagram types have a need, right? An unmet need. And I love applying that into this LARP framework, right? And being able to sort of start to identify what are the needs of these different both player characters, as well as like how can you structure interesting unmet needs for non-player characters to allow like space for people to play with that.
That sounds like a good design challenge for you. Is that Enneagram LARP, freeform LARP, maybe?
Yes.
Okay, great presentation. Thank you. Is there any literature or techniques you can recommend on consciously integrating the character experience into the player life? For example, with political activism.
Oh, hmm. I mean, the techniques that I am using here are wholesale taken from narrative therapy. I think that probably I would recommend doing more like research on narrative therapy. There's a couple of books that I cite in the presentation. I'll make those slides available that give a primer on narrative therapy that have a bunch of like technique about how to start thinking about and approaching some of these things that I think are really great. Um, yeah, I'm just a huge fan of narrative therapy and find it very inspiring and very applicable to our practice.
Yeah. If you look at our, it looks like Josephine put magic is real in there. If you could also put in transformative game design, because there's some integration practices listed there. There's also an article on nordiclarp.org that from somebody who talks about psychedelic experiences and lessons learned from those communities and bringing those into LARP. So that is quite interesting as well. I mean, there's basically a lot out there, but one of the things that we talk about in Magic is Real, Shal and I, who's here with us today, is narrative identity, which is sort of a subset of narrative therapy that focuses on creating a redemptive story arc for your life. So, using, instead of framing everything as, I'm unlovable, for example, framing things as, I felt that I was unlovable, and then I had this really incredible experience with this person and I felt loved, and that redemptive story arc being an important construction. And sometimes that's hard for us to do in our own selves, but when a character has undergone it, then we can actually have that embodied experience of it and maybe start to see how we can take those pieces into our life. But this requires work. This is not just something that happens. And so this integration and processing is it's a commitment, I really think. I mean, some of it might just happen sort of like without us realizing it, but a lot of it, I believe, is actually work.
I think so too. And my experience has been that if I'm not in a stable frame of mind, then it's not a good idea for me to LARP, like, because I'm going to be enacting negative patterns on people who I care about and potentially harming them. And so it's good for me to get the help that I need outside of the LARP context and be able to go into the LARP with this openness to curiosity and exploration, and not be using LARP as a weapon.
Yes, we could talk all day about that. But in general, but I think it's really profound is just having an intentional container with consent practices that we actually like model and practice together. And when I say practice, this is something we all need to continually practice. It's not something you just get one day. And then, finding ways to express oneself and express one's need, as we've been talking about, while also being respectful of the limits and boundaries of others, which is very tricky.
Absolutely. It's so tricky. Being a human is hard.
Being
And any
humans in relationship with each other is really hard too.
yeah.
Okay. How do these ritual steps adapt when the ritual is still being developed and tested?
How do the
Um,
ritual steps adapt when the ritual is still being developed and tested?
yes.
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I think that like uh so for me, some of the key parts of that are ensuring that you are leaving some of that blank space in for some improvisation and for participation to happen. And that's something that's kind of hard to test because you're not going to know how it plays until it plays. So I think that the best laid plans will go awry. So like accept that like that mistakes are included, and that your ritual doesn't need to be perfect and formalized and going in a textbook that's going to stand for the rest of time. It's okay for there to be room to move around in.
Unlike any design process, there's usually iteration, seeing
100%.
what works. Yeah. Can you speak more about post-game charisma and the dangers of this? I had a definite moment of recognition when this was mentioned.
Absolutely. So sometimes there are characters who are very confident to the point of braggadociousness or taking up a lot of space, or consuming all the energy in the room. And that when that happens, you'll feel a rush of power, and that rush of power feels quite good. And that is it's hard to sometimes recognize in a moment because you're feeling this euphoria and this high and this idea of like that I'm so great, that was great, everything's great, I'm awesome, I'm beloved. And then that might lead you down a path of making decisions that you wouldn't normally make, or interacting people in a way that you wouldn't normally interact with people, and potentially causing harm, right? So um it's just something to be conscious of, like that feeling of like power and euphoria is temporary, right? It's fleeting, and that it's helpful to not make big decisions when you're in that headspace.
I think also this relates to the difference between the debrief and the war story, because what I find is when people are in that post-LARP charisma state, they often want to war story at each other. And if the
Yes,
other person has A, not consented to that, or is B, not in an emotional state to be able to receive that story, it can feel kind of like being held hostage. So that's like a little minor example of, I think, what you're talking about. Does that resonate?
definitely. I've definitely attended debriefs in which war storying started happening, and it feels the energy in the room feels exhausted, right? It feels as though one person is doing a lot of like self-reflection and everyone else is a captive audience, right? And that doesn't feel good. What we want to be doing is having like energy flowing and everybody able to feel as though they're being received and able to give and able to receive. And that can shut down pretty easily with that post-game charisma.
Okay, so there's three more here. Are you up for it?
I'm up for it.
Okay, little consent check there.
Thank you.
Would you consider parts of the ritual technique suitable for children, LARPs, or ritual experiences, or are these rather meant for adults?
Oh yeah, absolutely for kids. I don't see why not. Yeah, 100%. I think kids would also come up with things that you'd never think of as an adult, and it would be brilliant.
I'm trying to write a LARP about getting out of bed, and the question that was just asked is making me think about that. I'm not sure which question that was, but do you have any thoughts about that scenario specifically? I'm not
Hmm.
sure what that was in response to.
Yeah. I mean, I really applaud the idea of writing a LARP about getting out of bed. That can sometimes just be the hardest part of your day, you know? That's really, really difficult. It brings to mind there's this song by an artist I really love called Narcissus Cookbook, called Good Morning Sunshine, I believe. Um, I don't know if I have like specific advice for how to design ritual around getting out of bed for your specific LARP. But I'd be happy to chat with you offline if you want to kind of like toss design ideas around. So hit me up.
I'm also thinking about freeform LARP as potentially having some meta techniques that might be useful there. Like, what are the voices saying to you when you're trying to get out of bed? Or is there a part of your body that is like a weight and somebody's enacting that? Or I don't know. There's lots of ways to play with that.
Yeah, like externalizing the can't get out of bed as an entity that you have a relationship with, and how do you negotiate that relationship?
And that's a lot of what therapists are doing in practice with clients using role playing games, is often externalizing these emotional experiences.
Absolutely.
And related to that, our final question is this similar to Gestalt therapy?
I am not as familiar with Gestalt therapy, so I don't know. I would have to do more research into it. I am much more interested currently in narrative therapy because it's the practice that I personally engage with. So it's a thing that I have the most context for and know the most about, and have the most number of friends in the therapist community who practice. So
There are two aspects of Gestalt that we talk about in our curriculum. Electra Diacolambrianou, who does the psychotherapeutic aspects of our work, talks a little bit about this, and she talks about the empty chair where you're sort of externalizing a part of yourself and talking to it in the chair, and you kind of switch back and forth. This is a really common one. And
That's
then,
so familiar. Yeah.
which I have done in a LARP, by the way, in character. So talking about ritual within ritual, very, very interesting. And in that LARP, it was a wizard LARP. So one person's aspect like became sentient and then like was in the LARP for the next 12 hours. So some very interesting things can happen when you try to meld some of these practices into a LARP setting. But I would say Gestalt and psychodrama and all of these forms are really specific in this is your role, this is what we're playing out, and they tend to be a part of you rather than a fully fledged character. So what I've heard a lot of people say who are familiar with both is that LARP is more expansive in terms of the different possibilities.
Mm, that makes sense. Very cool.
Well, do you feel complete with this conversation?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was so delightful. And thanks for everyone who stayed.
Yes, thank you for staying. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to follow the chat, but there's a lot of exciting activity going on there. Comments about whether Burning Man is a giant LARP. Not exactly, but similar, I would say. And just some wonderful, wonderful positive energy. So thank you so much for your talk. And in terms of our next event, they will be coming. There isn't anything technically scheduled right now, but please stay tuned. We do have some very exciting announcements to come soon. So with that, I will say goodbye to all of our lovely participants. Thank you so much for being here.